I am excited to welcome Eric Lombardi to this episode of Leverage. Welcome, Eric. Eric is the president of More Neighbours Toronto, and I had the great pleasure of seeing him speak at an event. Actually, it was the launch event, actually, of ABC Toronto. Ariel Kimmel, who created it. And as I said, I'm really excited to have coffee with her later this week. They're doing incredible things, and I want to hear more about it. And I was invited by Brad Bradford, who's another incredible advocate on housing in at the City of Toronto. And so I'm really excited to talk about More Neighbours Toronto and hear about what you guys are doing and just really dig into it. So
Of
welcome.
course. Thank you so much, Rachel, for having me.
So maybe you could just give our listeners a little bit more background on what I mean, you have such an incredible bio. Anybody who can look, you just have to Google Eric Lombardi and you can, kind of get a sense of like all the really fun stuff that he's accomplished in his life. You've lived a couple places, you've done a couple things, COVID threw you a curve, but yeah, I'll let you I don't want to steal your thunder.
I'm very flattered, so thank you for that. So my background, just to give everyone some reference, I studied engineering at Waterloo. I lived in the Bay Area for a couple of years, and I moved back to Toronto during the pandemic. And while I was in San Francisco, another city that's famous for its housing crisis, I got a bit involved with the YIMBY movement, or the Yes in My Backyard movement, that was really trying to overcome the housing crisis there that stems largely in part due to regulations that constrain supply relative to the demand for new housing. And due to very similar reasons for what we're experiencing here in Toronto. So when I moved back to Toronto, I wanted to join whatever organization was doing this broader based advocacy for housing abundance, because I truthfully believe that one of the fundamental challenges that we have in housing is really all of the rules, taxes, constraints, and limitations that we've placed on the construction of new housing that has made it a sin. And so that was really the motivation for starting More Neighbours Toronto. The background on the name for More Neighbours Toronto came from a campaign in Minnesota, actually, called the Neighbors for More Neighbors campaign, which ended Minneapolis's single-family zoning restrictions. So they
Really?
legalized, yeah. So
Interesting.
they legalized fourplexes, and also, broadly speaking, much more mid-rise housing, etc. And because that change was really much broader than the changes that we've seen in Toronto, Minneapolis is actually one of the cities that is building the most housing per capita, and it also has seen since then the least amount of rent growth and the least amount of price growth among major American cities. And so really showing the proof points of how enabling more housing to be built of all kinds does help the housing crisis. I realize I'm meandering a little bit now, so
No, no,
bring me
no.
back to earth.
I feel like there needs to be like a case study on that city and how they did it. I think we were talking before we started filming, it's really fascinating to me to really dig in and understand what is blocking more housing being built. And it's as I say it, I can hear people going, why do we need more housing? We have a million condos that can't be sold right now. Like if you look at the numbers in our market right now, we actually have, if you look at the numbers that we have, there are places in Toronto where we have 9 months of supply of product. We have 50% of our product is condos right now that aren't selling. So I think it's good for us to kind of qualify for people. What is that housing that we clearly need? Because there's stuff out, like people say, well, there's stuff out there to buy. What do you mean we need more housing?
Well, I think what we need to do is like take a step back and say, well, how did we exactly get into the position that we are in? And I think and I hear this argument all the time. Well, oh, we're building so much housing. Like, look at all these condos that are going up, right? But if you actually look at it from like a raw numbers perspective, we're actually building fewer units in Ontario than we were in the 1970s. And when you add on top of the composition of the units of housing that we're building, a lot of it has actually leaned towards condos instead of, townhouses, multiplexes, and single family homes. So that actually means that the amount of space that we're building is, per person is actually quite a bit less than it was in the 1970s. And if you actually look at, I can actually send you some data on this. We're building about half the amount of space per new resident than we were 40 years ago. And so obviously that contributes to the competition for new space. But we've also seen because we've restricted our ability to build so many of these other housing types, we've seen a really strong competition for developable land for condos. But condos are not what I would call a consumer product. In many cases, condos are an investor product. And I don't mean this to be negative towards investors, but if you're looking at, a new condo build, first of all, the per square foot costs are typically well above what the market price for those things are. The second piece is
You're sorry, you're talking about like a pre-con, right? Like if you go into a sales center, right, they sell on future value, not on what is value today.
Yeah. And so, one, you have to inherently speculate on the future price of the market. And then two, you have these long timelines. And I don't think there are many families out there who are saying, hey, I'm looking for a house for myself and my kids. And yeah, it'll be finished 7 years from now, yeah. Right? So you inherently, through the policies that have encouraged most of our housing to be delivered via these very intensive longer term projects that are capital intensive, they're engineering intensive per square foot, and then you add on a lot of the process costs and the new home taxes that create this differential in cost between existing supply and new supply. What you create are conditions for chronic undersupply, in which the demand for housing can never be proportionate to the amount of housing that you're building at any given time. And so that's why it's so important in the long term to bring these policies, I would say, back to earth. And even if you look at the supply that exists in today's market in Toronto, do I think that there might be some correction because we are seeing a lot of new supply, a lot of listings, particularly for condos that are sitting? Yes, but we've also seen a 60% reduction in new starts. And so if we're actually looking at affordability in the long term, well, come 2028, 2029, a whole bunch of new supply is not going to be coming on at that time. And so, the fundamental challenge for us is frankly to bring down the timelines that projects take, to bring the configurations into line with what families want, and to bring the differential in treatment of new versus existing housing into line. And if you do those things, we'll be well on our way to having a more sustainable and attainable housing market.
Okay, so that was a lot. I want to break a little bit down. It was amazing. Just want to break it down for people. So I think something that I found really interesting, and I wonder whether this is a policy that you would see changing, for example. So I think condos are a massive problem. I think that, and they are policy, I don't want to say like all of the problems with condos are policy driven, but so first of all, condos are really not usually where you would see yourself raising a family. Okay, it's not. Now, I did kind of preface this with you in the questions prior was, do you ever see us kind of getting to a situation where, we're like New York, where there's no longer this like rent shaming. Like, I think there's a lot of rent shaming that goes on. And I've seen it in my industry. It's like, get out of your rent's 100% interest, like go and build up equity, like, that whole like sales spiel. Which, by the way, I think that if you can, and you have the ability to, is the right thing to do. I mean, I think it's who was it? Oh my God, he's amazing. Prof G. I'm trying to remember. He's got a great podcast. His name's going to come to me. He's fantastic. And if you do the numbers, home ownership actually is not a great investment. Like, what it costs you to pay your mortgage, what it costs you to put, I just had a plumber in here. I'm probably going to have to move, like, I'm going to have to replace some pipes now in my house. I've got to pull the ceiling out. It's expensive, but it's a forced savings, right? Most people will not put that kind of money away every month. But, do we see ourselves getting to a situation maybe where, it's okay to rent and you put your money somewhere else, like you have in New York?
I think it is already perceived as okay to rent, and I actually do think that this is one of those elements that is more generational. And I think the reason for that is, many in my generation who can't count on family wealth or are not in career paths that pay an extraordinary amount and, to the top 3% of incomes in the city, well, you're to some extent right now locked out. And I think the real barrier, I mean, and the other point I would just say here is, regardless of whether or not the goal is for ownership or for rent, we have seen a deterioration in affordability across both types, driven by the exact same reasons. And so fundamentally, I think the choice to rent versus the choice to own should be one of personal goals and personal circumstance. I do think it is unhealthy fundamentally to say that people cannot participate in ownership in a liberal and democratic society. And if that is a truth, then something has gone fundamentally wrong. And so when I have...
Sorry, and I don't mean to interrupt you, but I think that's like a really strong word. Like when you say can't, like that you're unable to, or that you feel like that it's being locked out on you.
I think if the median person who comes from, a regular background, if they have no hope in reasonably affording a place to live, should they wish to settle roots, and they desire homeownership or property ownership and all of the benefits and costs that do come with that, then we've failed, I personally think, as a liberal and democratic society. Because if you take this, to a more logical conclusion, which is to say, well, more people should be comfortable with renting. Well, that means that homes and property are owned by fewer people, and increasingly you have an entrenched landlord class who can pass on their properties and create more hereditary wealth.
So it's a cyclical issue. It becomes a cyclical issue, is what you're saying. Like
you're heading towards a more feudal structured society in which being able to access places and opportunity is much more determined by where your parents come from than what your capabilities and merit is. And so when we look at the housing crisis, and I hear this, well, more people should rent, whatever. I mean, I do think it's fine to rent. I do think rent should be cheaper. But I also don't think it's healthy for us to say, well, we should just accept that ownership is going to be unattainable for the majority of people without help. Because that really is actually a policy-driven problem, and it really is a consequence of our choices, not, inevitable forces that are outside of our control. And we as a society can make different decisions that result in that ladder of access being attainable to far more people.
If I'm getting your positioning right, so you accept that it's okay to say, like, we're going to be like New York, and we're going to, say it's okay to rent, which I get it. Like, I think that there's definitely, we've gotten to the point where, yes, of course, it is okay to rent because you live in Toronto and there are no other options. But if I'm understanding correctly, you're saying, but that's not it. That's like just like defeat. That's just saying, okay, well, we're just going to accept now that we don't have the ability to own something versus correcting it so that we do have the ability.
Yeah, and it's also just, for example, like relative to income, the cost of rent in Toronto since 2010 has doubled, and relative to income, the cost of ownership has tripled. So our fundamental problem is this rising cost of housing, right? And the rising cost of living, regardless of whether or not you are renting or you are doing it for ownership purposes. And so the same challenges and problems that got us to this point are affecting both markets. So one other comment I wanted to sort of address that you mentioned is, well, most people don't envision themselves with their families living in a condo. But I would also say you know, this problem is also derivative of how we build today in general. One of the big reasons why More Neighbours and myself are such big advocates for what we call the missing middle housing, as well as reforms to things like the building code. Here's a really good example. In Ontario, all buildings, multifamily over 3 stories, require what's called double egress, which means there needs to be 2 stairs that are accessible to your unit. And the result ends up being a lot of really bad floor plate designs. In Europe,
Let's like tie a bow on that. Like, tell me more about what you just said, because that's going to be something that I think is really going to be an aha moment for a lot of people listening. But like, really explain what you mean by that.
one of the reasons why we can't have some of these great family-oriented units in multifamily buildings like they do across Europe, or even many of the nicer, more discreet designs that we get, is that we actually don't allow single egress above 3 stories. Whereas, in Austria, it's like 8 stories. In Germany, it's like 12 stories. I think in Switzerland, it's 20 stories.
And sorry, egress is like a
Exit.
stairwell.
Yeah, it's exiting, right? Through a stairwell,
You
etc.
have to have a front door and a back door, is what you're saying. You have to have 2 stairwells.
Yes. And so what you end up doing is you end up breaking up the floor plates in very odd ways. And it leads to a certain kind of building design. And you can add on all these other building code and design guideline restrictions that end up just raising the cost of units as well. And it ends up forcing a lot of units to be more poorly designed in general. But because almost all of our projects are these larger scale, longer term projects, you don't have families who are like trying to make their housing decision for something in the next year or two, which is really where most families who are in the market are considering. And so you look at all the new supply coming along, and it's not really satisfying the type of units and demand that families want. But that makes the demand for the pre-existing units that are a lot more like what families want even more expensive. And so that drives costs, particularly for existing housing as well. So if we want more families to, and I don't even say we shouldn't want more families to. If we want families to have the option to live urban in great family style apartments, we literally just don't have. We have made it illegal to build housing that serves that purpose. And so,
Yeah. And I didn't mean to say that, that's the quintessential, like if you want to, they say single family home, right? Like we even have it entrenched in the way that we describe product in our business. I sold a condo at Yonge and Eglinton that was a 1-bedroom plus den, which also there needs to be something around that is regulated conversation. And it had a door. So again, just didn't have a window to say that something's a bedroom has to have a window, a door, and a closet. Okay, great. So it didn't have that. I sold it. The agent represented a family that came here from the Ukraine that had 2 teenage children, and the teenage girl was going to live in the bedroom, and the son was going to live in like the living room and on a pull-out couch. And that is the reality of some of the stuff that we don't see on a daily basis that's not spoken about in the news. I have sold a condo that was, again, like a 2-bedroom to a 4-person family, like all sorts, because, and listen, they scraped together money, they got there, they now are, by the way, no locker, no parking, like nothing, okay? So I think that's a really fascinating comment about the stairwells, the egress, so things that we don't know, and I think that that's a easy policy. So again, just sometimes when things are done so often, they just can't figure out how to get out of their own way. The other thing I find very interesting that I think from a policy standpoint, and you can tell me your opinion on this, is, and again, I'm sure I'd have condo owners going, well, then they have to change this, and this about the pricing, because let's remember that 35% of every unit built is taxes and levies. So Government at every level is taking money from them. And by the way, most of the time, not even spending it to upgrade our sewers or our infrastructure and just holding on to it. But that's a whole other conversation. And so they're saying, okay, well, you have to make sure, because let's be honest, most of the inventory out there in condos are 0 to 1 bedroom and they're under like 500 square feet. That's the stuff that's not selling, right? But that's the stuff that the condo builders make money on. That's the stuff that the investors buy. Those are the stuff that they think they can rent. So they say, okay, well, we did our parts from a provincial level, and we said that a percentage of that building had to be 2 bedrooms. So 2 bedrooms, you can have a family in that, except they don't dictate the square footage. So that 2 bedroom could be 575 square feet. Do you know what 2 bedrooms looks like in 575 square
I mean,
feet?
you see it also, like I've been seeing 3 bedrooms coming to market with 700 square feet, right? Like these are not.
By the way, you can't find 3 bedroom anymore. Like that's actually to me shocking that you can't find 3 bedroom anymore.
But I think a lot of these problems are really just a derivative of bad incentives that exist as a result of policy. Like for example, like I was saying, so much of our new housing is actually in these intensive long-term projects and then you brought up a great issue, which is the taxes on new housing, right? So you have development charges, you have HST, you have many levies for like wastewater, education, all these facets, right? And if you were to look at a new 2 bedroom condo around 800 square feet in Toronto, it's going to cost you $1 million, but in that, there's $260,000 to $300,000 in taxes. But here's what I think a lot of people, particularly on the progressive side, don't understand. When you apply that amount of taxation to something new, but you don't apply that to something that exists, right? In economics, there's a like for like product replacement comparison. So if you as a buyer are going to say, hey, do I want to buy new or do I want to buy something that's just like it right now today? If the existing option is almost always cheaper and available sooner, then the only reason why you would choose to buy that new product is because, one, you don't have the money that you need yet to purchase that thing. But more importantly, because you believe that the value of everything else in the market is going to rise in time to justify the time value of your money now, spending it later. And that creates a circumstance in which anyone buying any new housing at all must be speculating on the future value of all housing. Otherwise, you would not do it. And so what does that result in? It results in an environment in which speculators dominate new purchases. And then you have a situation like we're in right now, where a lot of people are a bit spooked about the long-term value of housing because it has become so expensive. And then the investor who's speculating doesn't have a speculative case anymore. And then you see a collapse in housing starts. And eventually, if you don't address that in policy by making these changes, you're going to have a supply shortage again, and you're going to be in a situation where the cost of housing continues to outpace the ability for normal people to afford it. And so these taxes aren't an antidote to speculation like so many people seem to believe. They're actually a driving factor in the speculative case for new housing to begin with. And so I personally believe, and I think the economics supports this, that if you want more families and regular people to participate in the buying of new housing, you actually should eliminate a lot of these new taxes, because then the like for like benefit analysis veers a lot more towards buying something new than just buying something existing. And that's when you actually start to see prices come to be back in line or held in line with what people can actually afford.
I mean, that's the way the condo market was 10 years ago. I mean, that you could buy a condo and it was reasonable if you bought it early. There was advantages to buying it pre-sale. You were getting a different price. You had time to put it together. And then when you moved in, you had something that was worth something. Unlike now, where people, I mean, it's not a massive problem, but there are people that are defaulting. But can I ask you a question? Okay, so you keep saying policy. So, and we hear this all the time. We hear it on the federal level, we hear it on the provincial level. Like, we're going to introduce policy to whatever. So, if you ruled the world and you could now, make an impact in the Toronto housing market tomorrow, you're elected, Eric Lombardi's in charge, this is it. And you don't have to have anybody's vote, okay?
Great.
You're excited, right? So what are like the three major policies? Let's like really spell it out. What are the three major policies that if you could make a difference tomorrow, you would implement?
Tax reform, land use reform, building code reform.
Okay, let's spell that out.
So tax reform, we were just discussing this, but I'll give you some numbers to paint a picture. In year 2000, your average brand new 2-bedroom condo in Toronto, it cost in real dollars, so the value today, $250,000. There would have been about $2,300 in development charges on that, and it would have been exempt from HST because it's under $450,000. Today, you would pay more in taxes than what that condo costs in real dollars, inflation-adjusted dollars today. So, about $260,000 to $280,000. So taxes are now about 30% of new housing costs, and it's actually not that expensive for us to get rid of them because within an environment of 14 million people, all of these taxes are burdened on about 70,000 new units of housing every year. So it actually isn't that much money, but the distortion it creates for everyone else is bad. So tax reform is probably the fastest thing that governments can do to really move the needle on this problem.
Yeah, or land transfer tax. Like, I mean, people live in Toronto, double land transfer. You know how much? Thousands of dollars.
Land transfer taxes are a terrible tax. And
Terrible.
One of the reasons for that is in any economy, you want mobility or labor mobility. I live in Oakville. I just got a new job in Markham, but I can't really take it because the cost of moving, plus I don't know how good this job is going to be. I can't go use my skills somewhere else because now the cost of moving has become a barrier. So taxes on mobility are just like a universal economic mistake. And land transfer taxes, although it applies to all housing, terrible tax, should also get rid of it. It's not the type of thing that you want in a productive economy.
I could not agree more. Just to interject, like if you think in the city of Toronto, for every $1 million worth that you buy, it's somewhere in the $36,000 range. So now what we've got is a generation of buyers and sellers, which they're all lovely and appreciative and know that they're very they this wonderful opportunity. But if you think how expensive it is to move, like you have your realtor fees. Listen, it's not cheap. You get your house ready, realtor fees, and then you have to pay the land transfer on the other time. You're sometimes in the six figures just to move. Of course, you're not going to move to another part of the city. It's crazy.
Yeah, I mean, if God forbid that home is new, and then you're basically taking out a mortgage to pay taxes for the next 25 years.
It's crazy.
So tax reform, I'm not saying you need to get rid of everything, but you could probably bring down the tax component on most new housing that, I did some work with the Ontario Liberal Party. Our proposal was to eliminate DCs on all units of housing under 3,000 square feet, which is really the size of a family home that could fit, a family of 4, a family of 5, that would have been traditional for the middle to upper middle class in the 1990s, right? So, I do think that politicians are hearing it. And, I think if Doug Ford really wants to do something substantial on this front, it doesn't actually cost that much to do relative to the other things that we're spending it on. And it's the fastest thing that you could do to make a difference in the economics of new housing tomorrow. Okay, land use.
He has no opposition, so he's not going to do anything, unfortunately.
I want to get to land use. So land use is all about what we allow people to do and where. And in the city of Toronto, land use, and I mean, I'd say this is true across the Anglosphere, but it's particularly true in hot cities like Toronto and Vancouver. If you were to fly into Toronto, there's something that you've probably noticed and observed, which is you have condos along Yonge Street, these really concentrated, high density centers, but most of the city is, low rise residential.
Low
It almost
density.
looks like a forest when you're looking at it. And that's not because, the market and free competitive economics made that choice. That's because the government said, well, you can't do anything here other than this thing. So we have seen some incremental wins on land use in Toronto. For example, you're allowed to build a multiplex as long as it doesn't exceed the size of what you're also allowed to build in a single family home. But that's one of the other challenges. And so if I'm looking at a market like the GTA, but specifically Toronto, and I'd even say not just Toronto, but old Toronto. If you were to, for example, allow 6 stories, 10 units, basically by right, everywhere between like High Park, Eglinton, and Victoria Park, would people love that? No. Would you find that you've really reduced the scarcity for land and in a lot of cases driven down land values everywhere else in the GTA and within your own city? Yes, right? And what you'll end up doing is for all new supply in these areas that can be built faster, reduce the land acquisition cost component of net new housing. So what you're allowing by right matters. And this includes things like most of our transit corridors. If you were to drive down the Danforth or get out at Woodbine Station, you're looking at a single family home. And we've spent billions of dollars on this transportation infrastructure. So, whether it's adopting, BC style major transit station areas where you say, do you know what? Right outside the transit station area, you can build up to 20 stories. 500 meters from the transit station, you can build 12. 800, you can build 8. To saying, hey, if we're in Toronto, you should probably be allowed to build 4 stories or 6 stories by right.
I think it's coming, isn't it? In the East End. I think that's now, or it's rumored to be coming. I don't know.
So, as part of the Housing Accelerator Fund, the city said they would explore adopting a 6-unit, 4-story by right law. The problem is that was a year ago. So they said that they would do it within a year. And then a couple months ago, they said they would have a study done for the end of 2025. So the city is really deliberately rolling this kind of reform. And, I do get it. People who have already bought into the neighborhood that they like a lot don't want the house next to them that's 2 stories becoming
They don't.
4, right? I get that intuitively. I think the problem is we've really moved far away from why we zoned in the first place, which is really to keep people separated from intensive and polluting industrial purposes to
We miss
my neighbor is not allowed to have property rights in a free market liberal economy. And so I understand when someone is angry that, hey, the person next to them wants to redevelop their property to allow more housing. But the reality is, at least to me, one of the reasons why we should have a low tax barrier to moving is that places that make sense to develop and to grow into bigger neighborhoods because they're well connected, jobs and transportation are attainable. The response to I'm not happy with someone building next to my house means, hey, maybe I'd be happier in a neighborhood with less intensive growth. And you, as someone who seems to not want to live in the city, should consider that change. And then someone might buy your property to do the exact same thing and intensify. And then you end up with housing in urban environments that is actually proportionate to the demand of it. And I think the attitude of, hey, my neighbor has fundamental property rights in a free country, even if that upsets me, needs to be a more common attitude in general. I'll even make a point. Right outside of my condo there's something called the Foundry, which is a old historic building here in Corktown that the provincial government made efforts to come in and demolish so they could build new housing, and people were upset about that. Even though I'm going to lose my view, I'm totally fine with the government building new housing there. I just think that they should try to keep the buildings there because this whole area is new and
Yeah,
it's one of
I
the
would
few
too.
historic things there.
Yeah.
So let's figure out the economics to make this work. I don't care if you build a 40-story building. Like, this is downtown Toronto, go nuts, right? But I recognize a lot of people don't have the same type of attitude towards this issue as I do. But we need to have a fundamental shift in which we give each other permission to live our best lives. And what that might mean is, hey, someone next door is opening a cafe because it's always been their dream. And now I might be able to have a nice place to go walk to get a coffee. But we also saw the city of Toronto say, no, we're not going to allow that, right? So land use is about what we allow people to do with their property, and we've been too restrictive.
I feel, sorry to interrupt you. I feel like there's a big, and that could be like a whole other episode, but I think there's a big difference between like, my neighbor who's like, you know what, I'm going to open up a restaurant because I've always wanted one next door, to, my neighbor next door going, I'm actually going to build a garden suite in my backyard and I'm going to rent it out because I want to create another piece of housing, or I want to turn my house into a rooming house because for whatever reason, right? I mean, I also live at Bathurst and Lawrence, and RioCan is about to redevelop a large, very well-known plaza at the corner, the intersection. And if I tell you, the comments in the neighborhood chat, oh my God, what are we gonna do? The density, and I'm like, where do you think people are living, guys? Like, where are you going when you sell your house? I'm like, where are all these people going when they want to downsize, but they want to, let's even just look at that. Like, look at it practical. Let's even just go inwards and say, what maybe might you need? Like, when you sell your house, where are you going to live? Like, there's another option for you within the
A
area.
lot of neighborhoods actually just don't have downsizing options. And so
Oh,
the other thing I often point to for people is if we had broader, less restrictive land use, you would also see a lot fewer condos going up. Because the math on tall buildings is actually not great. Like, when you look at what does it cost to actually physically build per square foot, building over 8 stories, you get much more intensive because building code requirements also change at that level, right? You have high capital costs because the projects take a long time, which means the construction loans incur far more interest as a part of the input costs. So the fact that we see so much high-rise development in Toronto is emblematic of how restrictive land use is in general. And so more abundant approach to building housing would actually probably see fewer cranes in Toronto rather than more, which is, I think, a fact that would shock the majority of people.
well, I think it makes total sense, right? But I also question you on why you think there hasn't been more action on the Main Street policy that was that was tabled, because I've seen a little bit, like very little. But if you think, okay, so I have a house on Lawrence West, and I could build a 3-story house here, and I can live on one of them, and or I can just build it and I can sell it now as a totally different,
Yeah, so for example, we got the avenues policy in, and it gives the right to build up to 60 units up to 6 stories. But people are like, oh, why, that should be great. Well, we always find unique and fun ways to make sure most projects aren't viable. And the poison pill in that legislation was a mandate that half of all the land for these properties be permeable surfaces, which means grass, garden, etc. And if you look at what the city builds, it takes terrible care of its own trees. It gives them very little space, but they do want the private builder and everyone who comes into that to be responsible for managing much more of that.
Yeah.
So almost nothing, even with the reforms that we've seen, like for example, the multiplex bill, right? If you want a lot more multiplexes to be built, you should give it greater permission than you would for an ordinary single family home. But you don't have it. And so, you can say that you've done the thing in principle, but we find unique ways to make sure that it doesn't work. And that's been a very strong trend in the city of Toronto. And I actually, I don't think the solution is the city of Toronto doing some of these things. I actually think all municipalities they all do this the same way. And to me, the way to have a mutual armistice on this is really for the province to go ahead and say, we are broadly going to de-restrict land use, either across a province or at least in the GTHA, and all municipalities...
Blanketly, that's a big change.
The more blanket it is, the actual fewer distortions it has on land value. A lot of people say, well, if you allow people to build more, then it's just going to raise the value of the land because you can build more on it. But what you want is land use to be so liberalized that there's very little competition for developable land. And in that case, you'll actually result in land values falling. And I'll say even more particularly, it is odd how expensive housing in the GTA is at the urban or suburban rural boundary. If you look at Northern Vaughan or North Peel or the fringes of Hamilton, a lot of that housing in a less constrained land use environment in the entire GTA would also be much less expensive. And so when you're creating new suburbs, which was where a lot of young families have traditionally chosen to settle, you would also bring the cost down of those projects because you will bring down the cost of land. So land use reform is so important because it's about what you're allowed to build. And similar to the complementary building code being the third one, is how you build it. And so there are things like single egress, which are just really outdated, non-factual policies that raise the cost of building any multifamily housing 3 stories or greater. But we also have things like very aggressive elevator codes. I'm sure you've been to Europe, and one of the things that you might notice when you stayed in Europe is that they have smaller elevators.
I don't use them. I will not go. There you go for all my listeners. Like my husband and I have traveled extensively, and we get to Europe and I'm like, I'm taking the stairs. I'm so claustrophobic. I won't go in. We were staying in.
See, someone like you ruled by decree in the building code that we will have large elevators.
No,
and that's how it was going to be.
No. I will go up the stairs. I didn't ask anybody to build an elevator for me. I'm just letting you know those are way too small for me. There's no way. By the way, they don't need to be so big. You don't need to have 16 people in them. But I just want to be able to feel like I'm not in a coffin. Sorry.
But if you take it to for example, let's say you're building a 6-unit building that's 4 stories, and you want to make that building accessible to someone in a wheelchair. You need to put in an elevator. But the small, European elevator that you're allowed costs a fifth of what the North American minimum standard requirements for an elevator look like.
Do they fit a wheelchair, though? Some of those wouldn't, though. I mean, accessibility is very important.
They're somewhere between how restrictive we are now and reasonable that, is important to acknowledge.
Okay, you're saying somewhere in the middle.
So, there will always be different demands for different kind of housing, and there will always be ideally builders able to cater for those demands. If that demand isn't being met, then there's an opportunity for someone else to get the value there. But when you have building code restrictions that just raise the default cost of building housing in the formats that people want to live, then you're thwarting all of these projects. And so there are many things around building code that, if we addressed it, would also make it cheaper to build new housing because you could use lower cost fundamental components. And what is the net of all these 3 things? You have a lower cost basis for producing your housing. The consequence is you need to take less margin to justify it. The consequence is you can build it faster, so you need less interest to pay on your construction loan. And you've opened your market to more buyers because if you can complete your project faster, more people will choose something new over waiting a long period of time. And this means that your fundamental market conditions are going to be far more conducive to more supply, but also more supply that's affordable. But there's another benefit that I think rarely gets talked about in these conversations, is that the more that the builder caters to the consumer and less to the investor, or less to just fighting the government to build at all, the better quality materials will be used, the better the architecture is going to get, and more consumer preference for discretionary benefits like good design become more important. And so what we'll end up with is more abundant housing that is more affordable and it's better quality and more beautiful, which is, I think, a great goal.
I was going to say, I feel like you just solved the world. I mean, I think that just, again, so we need to do a better job at really making tax policy changes. I've said it a million times, like I hear these politicians come up and we're like, we want to make housing, we're going to make housing. I'm like, so get rid of the land transfer tax. Like, it's the easiest thing you could possibly do. Do you know how my phone would be ringing off the hook with people going, this changes the game for me. So that's one. I love the idea of, just doing small things that would allow builders to build in an easier, more efficient way if they were to change the building codes. I would say to you, your third one about the multi-use, and I may be being a little NIMBY here, so forgive me, it'll be my age, but I think that there are elements to creating neighborhoods, and there are elements of green space surrounded by surrounded by air, houses where kids are walking around a neighborhood versus having a cafe or whatever anywhere you want. But I agree that there's too much restriction and there could be much better ways for people to utilize. And if you listen, Montreal did it. They have so many multiplexes. It's unbelievable, right? Compared to the way that we were built. But again, they're more European. So there you go.
What I'm going to do is also, in case you want any images.
Oh yeah, we'll put all of it in the show notes afterwards. I'm going to put in for sure.
I'm just going to send you a link to a lecture that I did. And it has lots of good data explanation, charts, things that I was talking about earlier that I think you might find interesting to flip through. And here's one of the things I'll say, and it's one of my fundamental beefs with Canadians, is
I have so many.
We technically live in a competitive liberal economy, but very few people trust competition to result in sensible places. And so when I talk about saying, hey, we should legalize by right the ability to have a small business right out of your home, that doesn't mean that it makes sense to open that business on every piece of property. So the places that will make sense will also be the most logical places generally to do it. And when you look at cities that have less restrictions, they end up with these really excellent urban patterns that end up making sense because it ends up making sense for people. The government didn't have to decide what made sense. And so I think the more that we allow our behaviors to drive the outcomes and less people with opinions in the government saying, here's what you can and can't do, the more likely you're going to have a beautiful city.
Would you say that errs on the side of capitalism, or?
I am a capitalist, and I want to efficiently tax the wealth of capitalism to support people. Okay. I don't want a central planning system for the private economy.
Okay. All right. That was a mouthful, but I hear you loud and clear.
I'm a liberal. I'm not a libertarian. I believe in free competitive markets and a well-founded welfare state that doesn't have an intrusive government on what everyone else is doing.
Well, we're about to find out soon, I hope, who's going to be doing that for Canada. And I think on a lot of levels, I agree. I think there's a balance of this is not fair and everyone should have the same thing, which is a little bit too socialist. I think that there are different levels of ability. That's just the reality of, I guess, even human nature. Um, but then I would also say that there's people who want to control everything and want to be able to say that the person down the street can't have that extra easement because it's going to, and really it doesn't affect them at all. So it's true. You walk down certain streets in Paris that would be considered residential, and there's like a great little jewelry store, right? Like you were saying, like, why would anyone put a jewelry store where it's not going to make any money? It's not going to survive. There's no point, right? You're not going to put that cafe where no one's coming. The challenge is, I think, is like, I have to tell you, I live on a park. The cafe may do really well next door to me, but I don't want it. I'm going to be honest, right?
And
So,
what I'd say to you is, like they shouldn't have like a max capacity of 50 people cafe, but like if it's like, a person and they sell a couple things and there's like one or two people coming at a time and they're walking their dog, it's probably not going to be the end of your world either. And you might even come to like
get
having it,
coffee too,
right?
exactly.
Your main gripe might be how much money you're spending there.
That's so funny. Eric, I feel like we will have to have you back because you just have so much insight into all of this, and we could have, and we didn't even hit on all of the parameters of More Neighbors. So thank you so much. Thank you for solving the housing crisis for us in this hour. I
I haven't
really,
solved it yet, but we'll keep chipping away. And, I guess to your listeners, what I'd say is, you know, trust people over governments, and
amen.
housing matters. If you want to live in a prosperous place, people need to be well housed.
I love it. Thank you so much, and thank you for your time.
Thank you so much for having me.